All right, let's talk about a skill that is absolutely essential today: critical thinking. We're going to get into how you can basically upgrade your own mental software to make way smarter, sharper decisions, especially when you're under pressure. Okay, let's just dive right in. So let's kick things off with a huge question. I mean, why is it that really smart, really experienced people can sometimes make just awful decisions? Well, it turns out it usually has very little to do with how intelligent they are, and everything to do with these little hidden glitches in how all of our brains process information. You see, our brains are absolute efficiency machines. To just get us through the day without being overwhelmed, they create these mental shortcuts. You might have heard them called cognitive biases. And look, most of the time, they work great. But under the wrong circumstances, these shortcuts can drive us right off a cliff. They can fail, and I mean fail in a big way.
So, our first mission here is to become expert bias spotters. We're going to dig into some of the most common and, frankly, dangerous shortcuts your brain loves to take, because learning to see these mental traps is the only way you're going to avoid falling into them.
First up is a really big one: survivorship bias. This is our natural instinct to just focus on the winners, the success stories, the things that made it. And while we're doing that, we completely ignore all the failures. The huge problem here is that the failures are often where the most important lessons are hiding.
There's a classic story that just nails this idea. During World War II, engineers were studying the bombers that actually made it back from missions. They saw that the bullet holes were all clustered on the wings and the tail, so the logical move was, okay, let's add more armor there. But a brilliant statistician pointed out their huge mistake. They were only looking at the survivors. The armor wasn't needed where the bullet holes were. It was needed where the bullet holes weren't, on the engine, on the cockpit, because the planes that got hit there, they never came back. And that story just perfectly shows how this bias affects decisions right now. So imagine you're tasked with creating a new fire safety standard for restaurants. The flawed way to do it is to only study the businesses with perfect safety records, the survivors. But if you do that, you're ignoring a goldmine of information from your restaurants that actually had fires. The real lesson, the much better approach, is to dig into the incident reports from the failures. That is where the life-saving information is.
Okay, let's move on to the next mental trap. This one's called anchoring. This is our tendency to just latch onto the very first piece of information we get. That first number, that first impression, it becomes this anchor that kind of drags all of our later thoughts and judgments towards it, and we don't even realize it's happening.
Just think about an emergency call. Someone calls in, they're panicked, and they shout, "It's just a small fire in a rubbish bin." That phrase, small fire, drops the anchor. It can cause the person in charge to totally underestimate what's going on, maybe send a smaller crew, and be way slower to notice the signs that the fire is actually a lot bigger. The key is to see those initial reports as just a starting point, not the whole story.
All right, next up, let's talk about the framing effect. Get this. If I tell you, this ground beef is 80% lean, that sounds pretty healthy, right? But what if I said, this ground beef is 20% fat? Suddenly, not so healthy. It's the exact same product. The only thing that changed was how I framed it, but it completely changes how you feel about it. And this isn't just about grocery shopping. Think about a budget request. Saying new equipment has a 98% success rate. That sounds pretty good. But what if you frame it differently? What if you say, our current gear has a 2% chance of catastrophic failure? Whoa, suddenly there's a massive sense of urgency. A real critical thinker learns to look past that emotional framing to see what the numbers actually say. Okay, so we've identified the traps, we know what they look like. Now for the good part. How do we actually avoid them? Let's switch gears from just spotting the pitfalls to actually building a mental toolkit that helps us make much better decisions. I want to throw a kind of wild idea at you. It sounds totally backwards at first. What if the best way to be confident in your own idea isn't to go looking for proof that you're right, but to try your absolute hardest to prove that you are wrong? This powerful concept is called falsification.
Look, most of us, naturally, we fall right into the confirmation trap. We get an idea, hey, we need more powerful water cannons, and then we go looking for evidence that proves we're right. Falsification completely flips that around. It forces you to ask the tough questions. How could this be wrong? What if the setup time is longer? Do we even have enough water pressure? What if the real bottleneck isn't the power of the cannon, but just finding the fire in the first place? If your idea can survive that kind of attack, then you know you've got something solid.
Here's another incredibly powerful tool, setting clear, testable rules. So often we start a project with these really vague goals, right? Like, we'll pilot the new software and see if it's better. That is a recipe for a biased decision. A much, much sharper way to do it is to create a testable rule before you even begin. So what does a good rule actually look like? Well, here is a perfect example. We will adopt this new software only if it cuts down filing time by at least 20%, it gets a user satisfaction score of 4 out of 5 or higher, and it reduces data errors by 25%. See how clean that is? There's no room for, I kind of feel like it's better. The data makes the decision for you, not your feelings.
Now, these tools are great, but they're pretty useless if they just sit in the toolbox, right? They only work if you actually use them. So for our last section, let's talk about how we can go from just a single act of critical thinking to making it a real, consistent, and powerful habit.
One of the best habits you can possibly build is keeping a decision log. It is so simple, but it is so effective. And its purpose is not to point fingers or place blame later on. No, its purpose is to create a learning loop for yourself. For any big decision, you just write down why you're making it, what assumptions you have, and what you expect to happen. Then, and this is the crucial part, you set a date in the future to come back and review what actually happened. It forces you to be clear in the moment, and it helps you get better and better over time. So let's pull this all together. What are the big takeaways here? First, just be aware that your brain is always looking for shortcuts. They're there. Second, make it a game to actively try and disprove your own assumptions. It's the best stress test there is. Third, turn those fuzzy, vague goals into hard, testable rules before you begin. And finally, get in the habit of logging your big decisions so you can actually learn from the results. And we'll leave you with one final thought to put all this into practice. Based on what we've talked about, what is one core assumption, something you take for granted about your work or even about your life, that you are going to intentionally challenge today? Thanks for tuning in.